This is an introduction to part of Catholic social teaching on the economic life, specifically preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. This will give a flavour of teaching, and it will cover teaching of the Old Testament, the Gospel, the Church encyclicals, and we'll consider a Catholic response and look at who the poor and vulnerable are today before giving us something to ponder. The treatment of the poorest was not new. Even 3,500 years ago, Moses instructed the Jews not to harvest or pick 100% of the crops, but leave some for the poor and for the traveller, and also told them to take in and support family who had fallen on hard times. These, he saw, were an instruction from God, and this was to make sure that the poorest were preferentially treated as part of society. Giving food later extends to a just treatment of the weak, not to take advantage of the poor, weak, but to maintain their rights as human beings. Their reward for kindness will be repaid by God, but unkind treatment will be punished by him. And this is underlined by the righteous and generous being called blessed, whilst the wicked and the oppressors of the poor will not fare so well. God shines the same on the good and the wicked alike, and there is a reason he makes some rich, and that's to help the poor. In the New Testament, we turn to the example of Jesus, who preferentially visited, ate with, and healed the poor and outcasts of society. The Beatitudes outlines the behaviours of a just society. Followers are blessed if they're humble, merciful, truthful, and righteous. He also adds in emphasis, give to everyone who begs from you, don't refuse anyone who wants to borrow. Whoever has 2 coats should share with anyone who has none, and the same with food. And to the rich, righteous man, he said, you lack one thing, go, sell what you own, and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, then come and follow me. And before his passion, the final preaching to the apostles about the final judgment, he outlines again what is needed to get a place in his kingdom. Feed the hungry, give thirsty something to drink, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care of the sick, and visit the prisoner. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So the teaching is to treat the poor, marginalised, oppressed as you would Jesus, and he will welcome you into the joys of heaven as your ultimate reward. Turning to the teaching of the Church, councils and encyclicals, we look at the current catechism where it says that God blesses those who come to the aid of the poor, and it's by what you've done for the poor that Jesus will recognise his chosen ones. And as with the Old Testament and New Testament, God blesses those who help the poor. Jesus knows he's chosen by the treatment of the poor. And poverty is seen as a form of oppression, which is why the Church has always worked on their behalf. The early Church instigated sharing all that they collected in common according to each one's need, and also started aid from richer areas such as Galatia and Corinth to Jerusalem, which was suffering a famine at the time. But you must always maintain a fair balance between what you presently have in abundance and their need. Coming closer to the present day, Vatican II says that the father and the doctors of the Church held this opinion, that teaching that men are obliged to come to the relief of the poor. Feed the man dying of hunger, because if you have not fed him, you have killed him. This focuses on the poor and starving, as at that time there were many areas that were suffering from starvation and hunger. Coming more modern, Pope Francis says that God shows the poor his first mercy, and inspired by this, the Church has made an option for the poor, which is understood as a special form of primacy in the exercise of Christian charity, to which the whole tradition of the Church bears witness. The poor then traditionally are always the first to receive acts of charity, but he also wants the church to have a life with the poor. The poor, he says, should be put at the centre of the church's pilgrim's way. We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voice to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them. As well as living with the poor, the Church decries an economy that excludes, creates inequality. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? This is a case of exclusion. Human beings, he says, are consumers in a disposable society. They're just consumer goods and are disposed. They're treated as leftovers. Pope Francis wants the church to have a life living with the poor, just as Jesus did, and is part of the Catholic response to the modern society. Vatican II started a specific organ of the Church to promote justice, love of Christ to the poor, and encourage the Catholic community to help the needy regions and to provide aid, witness to their plight, and to seek justice on their behalf. Pope Paul VI wasn't really satisfied with Vatican II's treatment of the poor, and he dedicated a full encyclical on how the nations and individuals should treat the poorer in trade, in work, justice and equality. So he presented a threefold obligation that the richer nations should give aid to developing nations, rectifying trade relations between strong and weak nations, and universal charity. No one, whatever his status may be, should be unjustly subjected to the arbitrary whim of another. 20 years later, Pope John Paul II confirmed that the increasing wealth of rich nations feeding off poorer ones has led to the emergence of a third and fourth world of poverty. Consumerism leading to a throwaway culture where we discard old for new rather than give it to the poor who maybe could make use of it. So if we go back to Francis just 9 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, we also have to say thou shalt not to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. Can we continue to stand by when food is thrown away while people are starving? This is a case of inequality. We have created a disposable culture which is now spreading. It is no longer simply about exploitation and oppression, but something new. The excluded are not the exploited, but the outcasts, the leftovers. And if we turn full circle now and go back to the Gospel, quoting Mark and John, for you always have the poor with you. Well, who are the poor and vulnerable today? If we look at the last few months of news in the UK, we see more than 1 million are below the poverty line. People are in work, but they need to use a food bank. The mother of 4, I literally, she says, have to choose between food and heat and hot water. A single mum, 38, she just about can afford her bills at the moment, but there's little left over for cash for unforeseen events. Somebody smashed into her car. My tumble dryer broke this week. My children do after school activities, which are quite expensive. I've got a good job. I'm on a fair wage, between £30,000 and £40,000 a year, and I'm struggling to look after 2 children. I dread to think how people with a lower income can do that. Well, that's poverty in the UK. Let's compare that and spread this out to the whole world. If we look at the life on 4 income levels, the first level are people who earn up to $2 per day. Level 3, so 2 billion living on this level. And finally, we come to the top level, those earning more than $32 per day. And that's us. So who are the poorest? So to summarise, the poor will always be with us. We should try and share what we've got with anyone else. And do we sacrifice a little just to make a big difference to the poorest? we should make room for the poor in our lives, and we should raise awareness of inequality in food, work, resources locally and globally. And that's what we should be doing in response to Catholic teaching on the preferential treatment of the poor. Okay, so we've finished there. Now for an activity, I've got a short quiz, 13 questions, and one discussion question if you want to move on to that. The quiz, first of all, if you start that, there are 13 questions. Take your time with this. You can pause and move the video on, and the next 13 questions. And finally, question for discussion. In light of the preferential treatment of the poor outlined, how can Catholics today respond to Mary, who said to Jesus, "They have no wine"?